One of the strangest, scrappiest little monster movies ever made in someone's backyard ended up inspiring Hollywood legends. Clay demons, homemade caves, stop-motion creatures, and a cast that did not even record their lines on set. Here's 20 weird facts you never knew about Equinox. Number 1. A backyard studio. Some of the dark caves in Equinox were not caves at all. They were built inside Dennis Muren's parents' garage. The crew had no money for studio sets, so they pulled together cardboard, plaster, and paint, then transformed a suburban garage into an underground lair. The walls were flimsy and often shifted between takes, but the camera framed it in a way that looked convincing. Lights were rigged up wherever they could find outlets, and most of the props were made from whatever was lying around the neighborhood. Sometimes the crew had to hold the fake walls in place while filming, just to stop them from tipping over. It was a low-budget trick that somehow worked on screen, giving Equinox its strange, handmade atmosphere. Number 2. Shooting was done with 0 permits. The outdoor scenes in Equinox were filmed at Bronson Canyon in Los Angeles, a spot famous for old B-movies and television shows. The catch was that the crew did not bother getting official permits. They were just a group of young filmmakers sneaking around with cameras, hoping not to get caught. To pull it off, they worked fast. They would run into the canyon, set up shots as quickly as possible, and roll film before anyone noticed. If a park ranger came near, the cast and crew would scatter and pretend they were just hikers with friends. It was risky, but they had no other choice because a permit would have cost more than their budget. These quick stolen shoots gave the film its rugged outdoor look. Number 3. Homemade monsters. The monsters in Equinox were not made in a studio workshop. They were built by hand inside Dennis Muren's own house. Using wire, clay, and latex, the crew created stop-motion creatures that looked otherworldly on screen. Each model had a wire skeleton that allowed it to bend and move frame by frame. Clay was sculpted around it, and layers of latex gave the skin a strange texture. The wings of the flying demon were cut from cloth and painted to look leathery. These small figures were animated on tabletops with lights clipped to wooden boards. Every movement was filmed 1 frame at a time, which meant hours of work just to capture a few seconds of action. Despite the simple tools, the finished demons stood out as some of the most memorable images in the entire movie. The group thought they had seen the worst the forest could throw at them. But the real terror wasn't inside the cabin, because just as the shadows settled and the book's glow faded, someone, or something, was waiting outside, watching, with wings, claws, and a very unnatural hunger for visitors. On the next fact, we're diving into the mysterious ranger who wasn't quite what he seemed. Number 4. Dave Allen's first gig. Before becoming a respected figure in special effects, Dave Allen got his very first real break on Equinox. At the time, he was still young and mostly practicing stop motion on his own. Dennis Muren brought him into the project because he knew Allen had a passion for monsters and animation. Allen worked on several of the creature sequences, helping to design and animate shots that gave the film its rough but ambitious look. Years later, Allen became known for his work on Puppet Master, The Howling, and even projects with Charles Band's Full Moon Features. Looking back, Equinox was the stepping stone that gave him hands-on experience in feature filmmaking. What started as a low-budget experiment in a friend's house ended up launching a career that horror fans would come to respect. Number 5. Donated matte paintings. Jim Danforth was already an experienced matte painter when he got involved with Equinox. Instead of creating brand new art from scratch, he donated several matte paintings he had lying around from older projects. These painted landscapes were placed in front of the camera to extend the world of the film. Suddenly, a low-budget backyard production had sweeping mountains, eerie castles, and strange skies. The trick worked because the paintings blended just enough with the live-action footage to make the story feel bigger than it really was. Without Danforth's contribution, the movie would have looked much smaller and less convincing. The crew could never have afforded such elaborate art on their own. By recycling work from another project, Danforth gave Equinox a visual scope that went far beyond its $8,000 budget. Number 6. Amateur crew. The people who made Equinox were not seasoned professionals. Most of the cast and crew were friends, classmates, or anyone Dennis Muren could convince to help out. Many of them had never worked on a film set before. Roles often overlapped. Someone who was supposed to be carrying gear might also appear as a background extra. A few even put on monster suits when needed. Because there was no money to hire a large team, everyone had to do multiple jobs. The actors handled their own costumes and makeup, while the effects team often moved props between takes. It gave the film a rough and unpolished look, but it also created a feeling of energy. What you see on screen is basically a group of students teaching themselves filmmaking while learning as they went. Everyone was juggling multiple roles, running around the set like a swarm of creative chaos. But even with all that energy, there was one technical hurdle they couldn't overcome: capturing clean audio. On the next fact, we're diving into why the sound in Equinox often didn't match what was happening on screen. Number 7. No sync sound. The crew shot Equinox on a wind-up Bolex camera. It was a reliable little camera for students, but it came with a major problem. It could not record sound while filming. Every single line of dialogue in the movie had to be recorded later and dubbed over the picture. This is why some of the lip movements do not perfectly match the words you hear. The actors had to come into a small studio and re-speak all of their lines, often without the same energy they had during the scene. It was a slow and frustrating process, but there was no other option. Getting a camera that recorded sound would have cost far more than their entire budget. The dubbed audio became one of the quirks that gave Equinox its strange, otherworldly feel. Number 8. The extra director. When Equinox was finished, the distributor Tony Lynn Productions felt it needed more material to work as a feature. They brought in filmmaker Jack Woods to shoot extra footage, add a little gore, and stretch the runtime. Woods also stepped in front of the camera, playing the mysterious forest ranger who turns out to be the demon Asmodeus. His new scenes were edited into the original student film, which is why the tone of the movie sometimes shifts from one moment to the next. The original crew did not have full control over the final cut. Even so, Woods' added material gave the distributor enough confidence to release Equinox in theaters. For audiences, it was hard to tell where the student footage ended and where the new material began, which gave the movie an uneven but unpredictable rhythm. Number 9. Student film roots. Before Equinox became a cult horror movie, it started as a humble student project. Dennis Muren, who would later go on to win multiple Oscars at ILM, was still working his day job at a Los Angeles photo lab. That job turned out to be the film's secret weapon. By using his employee discount, Muren bought rolls of film stock at a fraction of the normal price. Without that insider perk, the project may never have made it past the planning stage. What makes Equinox remarkable is that it wasn't financed by a studio, but by a group of young dreamers pooling together discounts, favors, and pure determination. Watching those early scenes of carefree friends driving into the mountains, you can almost feel the scrappy DIY spirit baked into every frame. Number 10. Shoestring budget. If Equinox looks rough around the edges, that is because it was made on pocket change. The original short film cost about $6,500, and when Dennis Muren and his team decided to expand it into a feature, the total budget crept up to only about $8,000. To put that in perspective, that is less than what a Hollywood studio would have spent on catering for a single day of shooting. Every effect, costume, and monster was squeezed out of that tiny budget. The fact that they pulled off a feature-length fantasy horror film with that little money is a testament to the crew's creativity and persistence. Equinox is the definition of low-budget ingenuity. If you're loving these insane behind-the-scenes stories from Equinox so far, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Which fact shocked you the most? And don't forget to subscribe, because the movie only gets weirder from here. We're just getting started, and you won't want to miss the next twisted tricks, monster mayhem, and DIY horror genius that made this backyard film legendary. Number 11. Huge return. For a movie made in a garage with friends, Equinox pulled off something incredible. On a budget of just $8,000, it went on to gross about $849,600 in theaters. That is over 100 times its cost. Independent films almost never see that kind of profit, especially in the late 1960s when distribution for tiny projects was nearly impossible. Word of mouth and drive-in bookings kept the film alive, and it found a surprising audience. What started as a student experiment suddenly turned into a financial success story, showing that sometimes even the smallest films can hit big if they connect with the right crowd. Number 12. Garage animation. Some of the stop-motion sequences in Equinox were shot in the most unlikely place, Dennis Muren's own backyard. Instead of a professional stage, he built a makeshift setup on the ground, complete with tiny backdrops and homemade props. Lights were borrowed from friends and rigged however they could manage, often balanced on bricks or stacked boxes. The models were then animated frame by frame, sometimes under the threat of weather changes or neighborhood noise cutting into the work. It was painstaking, low cost, and full of improvisation, but the results held up well enough to make audiences believe in demons and monsters on screen. It was pure ingenuity stretched to the limit, and it gave the film a distinct handmade flavor. Number 13. Bronson Canyon. Bronson Canyon in Griffith Park is one of the most filmed spots in Los Angeles, and Equinox made great use of it. The eerie cave openings and jagged rocks gave the student film an otherworldly backdrop that looked far bigger than the budget allowed. The funny part is that this exact location has been used for everything from science fiction serials in the 1950s to the classic 1960s Batman series, where it doubled as the Batcave. Countless B-movies leaned on its spooky tunnels too, but in Equinox the setting feels raw and unsettling. Shooting there gave the film production value it never could have afforded to build on its own, and audiences were treated to a landscape that seemed timelessly strange and menacing. Bronson Canyon gave Equinox a backdrop that felt far bigger than its shoestring budget, but no matter how spooky the caves looked, there were still limits to what a student crew could pull off. On the next fact, we're diving into the film's technical limitations and how those constraints shaped its iconic, rough-hewn style. Number 14. Film limitations. The wind-up Bolex camera used for Equinox came with a big problem. It could only capture about 30 seconds of footage at a time before someone had to stop and rewind it. For normal dialogue scenes, that was frustrating enough. But for effects work like stop motion or forced perspective shots, it made everything painfully slow. Every bit of action had to be broken into tiny fragments, which were then carefully pieced together later. The crew learned to work within those limits, often rehearsing movements over and over before finally hitting record. While it slowed production to a crawl, it also forced them to be meticulous and precise, which is probably why so many of the effects hold up surprisingly well decades later. Number 15. Criterion Rescue. Most low-budget monster movies vanish into obscurity, but Equinox got a second life decades later thanks to the Criterion Collection. Known for preserving important cinema, Criterion surprised everyone by giving this scrappy student film a deluxe home video release. The set included multiple commentaries, scholarly essays, rare outtakes, and even restored footage that had been lost for years. It was an unusual choice, but the release cemented Equinox as more than just a forgotten curiosity. It became a piece of film history worthy of study, celebrated right alongside art house classics. For fans of special effects and horror, the Criterion treatment made sure Equinox would never be buried or ignored again. Number 16. Frank Bonner's career start. Before sitcom fame, Frank Bonner was just another struggling actor trying to land a role. Equinox gave him one of his very first breaks playing Jim Hudson, the friendly hiker who tags along with the main group. Years later, Bonner would become a household name as Herb Tarlick on the classic TV comedy WKRP in Cincinnati, where he stole scenes with his loud suits and pushy salesman persona. Looking back, it is almost surreal to see him wandering through monster fights and supernatural chaos in this scrappy horror film. What started as a small role in a backyard production ended up being the launchpad for a career that would make Bonner a recognizable face on television screens across America. Frank Bonner might have walked away from Equinox as a future sitcom star, but the ripples of this little backyard film went far beyond launching careers. Its influence would echo decades later in ways fans of horror might recognize all too well. On the next fact, we're exploring how Equinox quietly paved the way for what would become the cult classic terror of the Evil Dead. Number 17. The Evil Dead Connection. Over the years, horror fans have noticed how much Equinox feels like a rough draft for the Evil Dead. Both films feature a group of young people heading into the woods, stumbling across a sinister book, and unleashing demons that tear their world apart. There is even a remote cabin at the center of it all. While there is no proof that Sam Raimi directly copied Equinox, the similarities are hard to ignore. Raimi himself admitted he was aware of the film, and the connections became a favorite talking point among fans. In many ways, Equinox can be seen as a strange ancestor to Raimi's cult classic, showing how low-budget creativity can spark ideas that echo decades later in the horror genre. Number 18. Cult, not mainstream. Equinox never broke into mainstream theaters in any serious way, but it quietly built a following on the fringes. Drive-in screenings and late-night showings helped the film carve out a place in the growing midnight movie circuit. When home video arrived in the 1980s, it found an entirely new life on VHS. Horror fans, monster kids, and curious collectors all traded copies, passing the film around like a secret. Its rough edges and strange energy became part of the appeal, giving it staying power long after similar low-budget efforts had disappeared. By the time Criterion rescued it, Equinox was already cemented as a cult item, loved by people who celebrated its flaws as much as its monsters. Number 19. Dennis Muren's first steps. When Dennis Muren made Equinox, he was just a young film enthusiast trying to figure things out with borrowed gear and homemade tricks. Nobody could have guessed that this scrappy start would lead him to become one of the most important visual effects artists in cinema history. After Equinox, Muren went on to join Industrial Light and Magic, where he worked on Star Wars, Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, and countless other blockbusters. He would eventually win multiple Academy Awards and help shape the look of modern special effects. Looking back, Equinox was his first major step, a training ground where he learned to stretch imagination further than money ever could. On this final fact, we see how amateur madness became history. Number 20. Amateur role became history. It all began with 4 friends who simply wanted to make a monster movie for fun. There was no studio money, no professional crew, and no expectation that anyone outside their circle would ever see it. With clay creatures, backyard sets, and unshakable determination, they finished Equinox and managed to get it into theaters. Against all odds, this tiny student project went on to inspire filmmakers, critics, and fans for generations. What could have been forgotten as a strange home movie instead became a piece of horror history that proved passion can sometimes be louder than budget. And here's a bonus fact: lost footage found. For years, fans thought parts of Equinox were gone forever. Scenes that had been trimmed during distribution disappeared, leaving only scraps in memory and rumor. Decades later, when Criterion prepared its restoration, reels of missing footage were rediscovered and carefully pieced back together. These included alternate takes, extended shots of the monsters, and even moments that gave more context to the story. Seeing these clips restored was like unlocking a hidden vault of 1970s DIY filmmaking. It gave fans a fuller picture of how much Muren and his team really shot, and how ambitious they had been despite such limited resources. That was Equinox, a tiny film made by friends with almost no money that somehow carved out a permanent place in movie history. From backyard monsters to underground cult screenings, this scrappy project proved that creativity always finds a way. And while it never became a mainstream blockbuster, its influence has echoed through horror and beyond. If you enjoyed discovering these weird facts, hit that like button, subscribe for more hidden film stories, and share this with someone who loves cult classics. Until next time, keep watching the strange, the forgotten, and the films that shaped cinema quietly.
Wow, that was weird.